Ever wonder why India has managed to maintain peaceful relations with most countries around the globe? A fascinating question, isn't it? To understand this, we must dive into the heart of India's foreign policy. Post-independence, India found itself in a unique geopolitical situation. With the scars of partition still fresh and the challenges of nation-building looming large, India had to navigate its way through a world divided by the Cold War. The country had to balance its need for economic development, protecting its newly won sovereignty, and maintaining peaceful relations with the rest of the world. Not an easy task, considering the tumultuous times. But India, led by its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, held its head high and embarked on a path that was unique and yet universally relatable. This path was neither east nor west, neither capitalist nor communist. It was a path of its own, a path that respected the sovereignty of all nations and promoted peaceful coexistence. This leads us to the inception of India's foreign policy. The seeds of India's foreign policy were sown right after its independence in 1947. A newborn nation, India had to navigate the complex landscape of international politics, and it was none other than the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, who took on this challenging task. Nehru, a visionary and a statesman, was instrumental in shaping India's foreign policy. He believed in maintaining friendly relations with all nations, irrespective of their political ideologies. This approach was a departure from the traditional bipolar world order, where nations were either part of the Western Bloc led by the United States or the Eastern Bloc led by the Soviet Union. Nehru's vision was to carve a unique space for India on the global stage, a space that was not influenced by the politics of power blocs. This vision led to the inception of the Panchsheel Agreement. Panchsheel, or the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, was an agreement between India and China, signed in 1954. The principles of Panchsheel were mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. These principles were not just a diplomatic agreement between two nations, but they were a philosophy, a way of life that India aspired to imbibe in its foreign relations. They were a reflection of India's ethos, its commitment to peace, and its respect for all nations. The Panchsheel Agreement, however, was not just about India and China. It was a message to the world. It was a statement of India's intent to maintain a neutral stance in the Cold War politics. It was a testament to India's resolve to not align itself with any power blocs, but to maintain its independence and autonomy in decision-making. These principles gave birth to the non-alignment policy, a cornerstone of India's foreign policy. The non-alignment policy was a manifestation of India's commitment to uphold the principles of Panchsheel, to remain neutral in the face of global power politics, and to strive for a peaceful and equitable world order. So what is this non-alignment policy we're talking about? Well, in the simplest of terms, the non-alignment policy is a foreign policy principle that guided India's international relations during the Cold War. It refers to the policy of not aligning with any major power blocs. In other words, it's about maintaining a neutral stance in international affairs, particularly in conflicts and disputes between major powers. During the Cold War, the world was primarily divided into 2 major power blocs, the capitalist bloc led by the United States and the communist bloc led by the Soviet Union. Each bloc was trying to influence and gain the allegiance of other nations. However, India, under the leadership of its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, chose a different path. Nehru believed that aligning with either bloc would compromise India's sovereignty and its ability to make independent decisions. Thus, India adopted the non-alignment policy, deciding to stay neutral and not join any of these blocs. Now, it's important to understand that non-alignment didn't mean isolation. India remained actively involved in global affairs. It played a leading role in the non-aligned movement, a group of states that were not formally aligned with or against any major power bloc. the non-alignment policy had a significant impact on India's international relations. It allowed India to maintain friendly relations with countries across different power blocks. It also gave India the flexibility to make decisions based on its national interest, rather than being bound by the dictates of a power bloc. Moreover, the non-alignment policy contributed to India's global image as a peaceful nation that promotes international cooperation and harmony. It allowed India to play a constructive role in mediating conflicts and promoting peace in various parts of the world. So, in essence, the non-alignment policy was not just a strategic choice, but a reflection of India's commitment to peace, sovereignty, and independent decision-making in international relations. The non-alignment policy has been a defining aspect of India's approach to international relations. Let's delve deeper into the main points of the non-alignment policy. This policy, born out of the political and cultural milieu of the mid-20th century, positioned India uniquely on the global stage. It was an assertion of India's autonomy, a statement that India would not be a pawn in the Cold War power games but would chart its own course. The first principle of the non-alignment policy is peace. India made a commitment to maintain peace at all costs, to avoid aggression and war. This commitment was not just passive, it was active, with India playing a role in mediating conflicts and fostering dialogue among nations. Peace for India was not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice and equity. The second key principle is sovereignty. India has always been a staunch advocate of the sovereignty of nations. It believes that each country has the right to make its own decisions, to determine its own destiny. This respect for sovereignty meant that India did not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, and it expected the same in return. The third principle is mutual respect. India sought to foster relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. It did not seek to dominate other countries or impose its will. Instead, it sought to build relationships of cooperation and mutual benefit. Lastly, India promoted the principle of equal rights and self-determination of all peoples. It stood against colonialism and imperialism and supported the struggles of people for independence and self-governance. It believed that all peoples had the right to determine their own political status and to pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. These principles have shaped India's interactions with the world. They have guided its foreign policy decisions and have influenced its stance on global issues. They have also helped India navigate the complexities of international relations, balancing its national interests with its commitment to global peace and justice. These principles have helped India maintain peaceful relations with countries around the globe. But does India still adhere to the non-alignment policy? That's the question we're grappling with as we delve into the evolution of India's foreign policy over the years. After the Cold War ended, the global political landscape underwent drastic changes. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the world was no longer divided into two opposing blocs. This shift allowed India to reassess its foreign policy. You see, the policy of non-alignment, which served as a guiding principle for India during the Cold War, was slowly replaced with a policy of multi-alignment. Multi-alignment, in essence, allowed India to engage with multiple powers simultaneously without committing to a single bloc. This shift was not a rejection of non-alignment, but rather an adaptation to the changing global dynamics. India could now foster relationships with different countries based on mutual interests and shared goals rather than ideological alignment. But the evolution of India's foreign policy was not just influenced by geopolitical changes. The economic liberalization of the early 90s also played a significant role. As India opened its economy, it also opened its doors to increased foreign relations. It started attracting foreign investments, built economic partnerships, and became an active participant in global trade. This economic transformation influenced India's foreign policy, making it more pragmatic and less idealistic. In the era of globalization, India's foreign policy has become more dynamic and flexible. It's about building strategic partnerships, promoting economic interests, and asserting India's role on the global stage. Yet, even as it adapts to these changes, India's foreign policy continues to uphold its founding principles. It still values sovereignty, champions peaceful coexistence, and advocates for a just and equitable world order. So, to answer our initial question, but does India still adhere to the non-alignment policy? Well, in a way, yes. While India's foreign policy has evolved to respond to changing global realities, it has not abandoned its core principles. It has merely adapted them to suit the needs of the present day. Indeed, India's foreign policy has evolved with time, but its core principles remain intact. So, what can we take away from this discussion? As we've journeyed through India's foreign policy, we've seen how the nation has deftly navigated the international landscape. From its inception, India's foreign policy was deeply rooted in the principles of non-alignment. This policy allowed India to maintain autonomous decision-making, free from the constraints of power blocs during the Cold War era. This approach played a pivotal role in shaping India's peaceful relations with other nations. It allowed the country to foster ties based on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than forming alliances based purely on power dynamics. This unique stance has evolved over time, adapting to the changing global scenario, but its essence remains the same. Remember, foreign policy isn't just about politics, it's also about preserving peace and fostering mutual respect among nations. And that's what India's foreign policy aims to achieve.